how we have successfully implemented this process in a few of different areas within our own practice. So as Linda mentioned, remote testing in this telemedicine was kind of forced on us. I don't think anyone was entirely expecting this as a result of the pandemic, and I'm impressed with how quickly everyone mobilized and got telemedicine clinically, got things working from a research perspective. I think we've all done a fantastic job. But taking a step back, as Linda said, the pandemic has changed things, and so I do think we need to do a great job of kind of planning now for what this looks like in the future. So will remote testing or telemedicine be right for every situation? Maybe, maybe not. But I do think we need to have more of a thoughtful, multi-step kind of decision-making process to determine if this modality will fit the needs for your clinic or for your particular research study. That way we'll all be successful, we all get the information we need, we're providing the best care for our patients, and they're also happy and having their needs met. This way. So step one is, what are your needs? So it's important to define your needs. I think what we need clinically can vary dramatically from what we need in a research setting. Telemedicine allows us, as Linda mentioned, to access a much more diverse group of patients. We can reach patients we didn't know about previously or that maybe didn't feel comfortable coming into the clinic, and I think that really expands our ability to interact with these patients and will enrich our clinical practice and clinical trials. So we think about this kind of as a spectrum, so with clinical practice at one side, research at the other. I will say, we would recommend treating your clinical practice as a research trial to ensure that the vigor and quality of your data collection is as close as possible. But that being said, on the clinical side of the spectrum, you can use kind of what's available with the family. You can use, chairs in their home or couches in their home versus in a research trial. We really do want to make sure that everything provided and used is as similar to what is available in the clinic as possible. Lower internet quality or maybe a lack of internet access is probably okay for some clinical applications. Whereas for research, we'd want higher internet speeds where we're actually able to see patients without all that buffering or choppiness. The next one is simple visit preparation. I use that term loosely. I know our nursing staff would not call our clinical visits simple prep because it does take some time to walk families through the process of accessing the portal and gaining access to that clinical provider. But it is different than the amount of preparation needed for a research trial. So clearly then when we're supplying standardized equipment, using specific portals that may be easier or more challenging to use, there is a lot more prep that goes into those sorts of things. Similarly with the clinical use or application, you can be a little bit more flexible in terms of the environment. So for some of the patients I've seen via telemedicine, they're on vacation or they're, sitting outside on the porch instead of having to be in that standardized clinical environment. Comparatively, for research, we do want to try and mimic our clinic environment as much as possible. So trying to have, hard floors versus shag carpeting that could impact a child's ability to perform these measures. So really, process is everything. So the key to success is to have a well thought out process, as I've said before. So this, this was all kind of foisted upon us. New things feel scary for us as well as for patients. And so the more we have a clear plan and process and we communicate clearly, the more buy-in we'll get from families, the more comfort we will have, and everything will go more smoothly. So we want to guide patients and the staff through this what feels like a maze, although I do think we're all starting to find our way at the end of the light at the end of the tunnel. So you can allow practice attempts. I know when my son had some clinic visits and we were utilizing that telemedicine platform, I had the ability to kind of log on in advance to make sure I knew where I was going and what I needed to see. Similarly, allowing staff to do that, getting comfortable with that platform, and assessing the access to that platform and the environment prior to any visits will just make sure everyone's aware of what's coming down the pike and prepared for that. There is no one-size-fits-all approach, but I will say the common theme is that the more communication and the better process you have, the more success you'll have. For those that are listening that are involved in industry-sponsored trials and are really excited to do remote assessments, that's great, but make sure you aren't moving forward and implementing something that doesn't have your sponsors' review, approval, sign-off, and oversight. All of these sorts of things do need approvals. And there are a lot more logistical considerations when you're trying to standardize things across a multi-site international trial, for example. So here's kind of a general process that we had kind of set up for one of our early trials that we got up and running early this year in response to this pandemic. So we had a trial where we were having some key visits happening, which I'd say that happened for a lot of our trials at this point, unfortunately or fortunately. So we set up kind of this initial call with the families to talk to them about what does this even mean? Yes, we can't come to you. How is this going to impact your study? To get their interest in whether they even want to participate in a telemedicine approach. Started talking about how we thought this process was going to go, and then figured out what they had in the home, what we were going to need to provide for that family. Then we set up a kind of practice call where we contacted them, tried out the portal. We were using at that time Zoom, which was approved by our IS department here. We could do kind of a practice run, make sure everybody was comfortable getting on the call, knew how to push all the buttons before everybody had Zoom fatigue, that now we're all experts. And then we've finally set up that testing day where we could perform our assessments. The family knew what to expect, they had everything ready, and then the actual visit took just about as long as the visits that we do in our standardized clinic, so we were able to collect that data successfully. I think equally important, I know everyone is moving kind of toward this default video conferencing platform, but it is important to understand that there are different portals where we can be collecting standardized data, and one isn't better than the other, it's just one. There are pros and cons to each approach, and some will fit other needs better than others. For example, some phone calls I think are more appropriate for clinical care. You may be able to collect for research trials some high-level data in terms of reports of adverse events, medications, and those sorts of things. Video conferencing, I think we're all kind of aware of, where there's a variety of portals these days. And then there are also cloud-based sharing options, so potentially for patients that may not have the best bandwidth or internet speeds, you still may be able to get some videos via some cloud-based video sharing solutions. I know there was a huge learning curve for me. I thought I was a little bit tech savvy before this started. And then, all of a sudden you're hearing all these things being thrown at you, words I hadn't heard, and I didn't entirely understand what they meant. So kind of at a high level, we have video resolution. So if you're using a video conferencing platform, it's important to think about the resolution you're getting. So there's everything from a standard definition, old TVs, to high definition, nice HD TVs. For research purposes, you can probably get the information that you need from a standard functional assessment using any of these resolutions. This is just the number of pixels in each direction, so across your screen and vertically. And most standard definition, you can see what you need to see. That being said, if you do have if you're assessing the size of something on a patient's skin or trying to look at something that might be a little bit more fine-grained, it may be important for your needs to have a higher definition video feed. I think the most important thing is internet speed. On average, they say having about 1.5 megabits per second in speed is what's needed for video conferencing platforms to avoid having that lag or buffering that you can see, that choppiness. But it is important that both the upload and download speeds have this ability. So speaking from my own experience, when we started having all these video calls at home, I would find I could see everybody, but for some reason they said I was choppy or my video was freezing, and we found out that our download speeds or the video I was receiving was fine, but our upload speeds were too slow. So, I wasn't able to get that information from my house out. It's also important to understand how many people are in your call and how many video feeds are being processed at the same time. So some group calls, you may need up to 2.5 megabits per second in speed to manage all those video feeds. Similarly, when you're sharing your screen, you'll get lower frame rates through these video conferencing platforms. So it's important to consider all of those things when you're setting up your process to make sure that if you do need video to score from, establish time tests or something that you do have the needs, or you do have the speed that you need to be able to assess those things. For cloud-based solutions, so now we're recording all these videos, they have to go somewhere, so there's that balance between really high quality, high frame rate, a lot of information, and upload speeds. So sites don't have all of the time in the world, so the larger the file is, the longer it takes, the more cumbersome the process. So you have to find that balance that works best for you. And then the last thing I do want to really stress is that no data is better than invalid data. So we can have the best process and you put it in the hands of someone who has no idea what they're doing or what they're supposed to be doing, and it all falls flat. So the FDA, as Linda mentioned, released guidance for clinical trials and telemedicine in response to COVID, and they made the statement that those that are performing these should be trained on how to conduct these video conferences. And then they did provide some examples, so having a simulated remote assessment as a practice. But really the key points were that we need to protect patient safety and privacy and enable complete and accurate data collection. So those are the key things you need to focus on. But I will say, we're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We really do need to focus on having that for research trials, industry standard training, and trying to maintain some sort of inter-rater reliability even in these times of travel restrictions. So some of the next few topics I wanted to talk about are some of the things we've learned, again, in these past few months in terms of troubleshooting, what's gone well, what's been tricky. So safety is the number one priority. We're not there to be providing assistance or covering patients to ensure that they're not going to fall, providing assistance with those movements. So it's really important that the caregiver is on site for safety, whether that's a spouse or a parent or the nurse or whoever is comfortable and is safe themselves providing that assistance. That's what's key. You may need 2 people in some circumstances, so we'll talk a little bit later about videoing and who should be doing that, but if you've got a caregiver who's responsible for videoing, they're not going to be able to be around for safety, so you may need 2 caregivers in that instance. And then the environment is really important. So again, whether it's clinical or research purposes, the crazier and more hectic the environment is, the less true data you're going to get. And so it's important to try to have as quiet of an environment as possible. In terms of that communication and buy-in and follow-through with the family, it's really important to provide resources and education to them, to the staff, that kind of go through all of these sort of learning modes. So having some sort of visual reference, whether that's a quick sheet, remember here's the buttons you push on your video conferencing platform of choice, here's some of the assessments we're going to be doing. Also having the opportunity to talk through the process. I know I'm a very auditory learner, so I do like to talk through things, and then giving those kinetic learners the chance to practice, actually push the buttons, maybe practice with their child doing some of the things that they need to do. In terms of internet accessibility, one of the things that came out in the FDA guidelines was that sponsors, particularly for sponsored trials, that they need to develop procedures for provision of technical support to facilitate assessments. So what those words meant were providing access to that internet or the technical requirements needed to participate in those assessments, so that we didn't create a barrier by moving into remote assessments. So that's, providing portable hotspots is an option that I've heard people doing. Additionally, allowing patients to video some tasks or specific testing and then upload those to those cloud-based portals. So there are options for that. Moving specifically into the video and the assessment, video quality is key, and we are not all just born videographers, so there is a bit of a learning curve. It's important to use some sort of tripod or stand, otherwise you will be nauseous very quickly as people are moving through their house. We need to be able to see what the patient is doing, and we're not going to be able to figure that out if everything's moving. It's helpful to have some identification or confirmation of the visit within that video, so whether that's on a whiteboard or you're verbally saying what day this is, who the patient is, so that that's all captured on that video. We want to make sure everybody's aware when the recording starts and stops, so that we're all kind of consenting to that process and we're not capturing things that people didn't know were being recorded. And then thinking about how many videos or different angles are needed, and this is very different depending on your study needs or your clinical needs. You may need 2 angles, you may just need 1. Timed tests are interesting. So I think the jury's still out on whether we can do this, and it depends a lot on internet connectivity. So we need some high frame rates, we need some reasonable internet speeds, and so accurate timing may not always be feasible during that live feed. So you may need to do some sort of in-home video capture that can then be post-reviewed, or if that's not a valid method, then those may not be able to be captured. And then, as I alluded to before, who should record? This is going to differ depending on the study, but it's recommended that the study staff is managing most of the recording if possible for the study needs, but there can be some in-home capture as well, but we want to make sure that if that occurs, it's not influencing patient safety, which is the most important. So now we're going to move to Megan Iamanno is going to talk about how we've implemented this in one of our research studies.
Thank you. So, as Linda and Lindsay both previously discussed, the FDA does recognize that investigators may be unable to conduct assessments on site for some of these for some of our trials, and that remote assessments are a necessity. Therefore, they have released recommendations on conducting clinical trials during the public health emergency of COVID-19, with remote assessments, video or phone, being included in consideration. These recommendations provide a general outline for modifying research efforts so that as to not put the safety of our subjects at risk, but also to continue to collect important efficacy endpoint data as you're able to. It includes discussions regarding protocol modifications, documentation criteria for missed visits, guidance for monitors and sponsors, and then, of course, implementation of alternative processes for collecting functional assessment data. Specific to remote assessments, they emphasize the importance of ensuring your clinical evaluator team is trained, as Linda mentioned, and not only trained specifically in performing the assessments, but also in understanding the flow of the visit and the documentation needs. So this would include documenting the date and the time of the assessment, the location of the subject, and then also the location and the name of the evaluator. So this is much like what you would document on site in your clinical record forms. As is always clear with clinical trial assessments, there's also the emphasis on limiting variability as much as possible. So we want these assessments to be performed in a manner as similar as possible to how we would conduct them on site. And we'll get into that a little bit more later on. And then so you can find this document by searching FDA guidance on the conduct of clinical trials during COVID-19. And you can search that on Google or on the FDA website. And this document is continually updated, so it's a good reference and a resource throughout the entire remote assessment process and through our public health crisis. So I thought it would be important to take a moment and kind of discuss the differences between a pre-recorded video of a subject completing a functional assessment and a live stream assessment. If there are any clinical evaluators that are listening in, we know we've all heard over and over again at investigator meetings and CE trainings that we should never score from a video. And partially that's because of what we see in person is supposed to be the most reliable. And those rules still apply to these remote video-based assessments. CEs should not rely on being able to rescore from the videos, much the same as we would not rely on rescoring the videos in an in-person encounter. These remote assessments are live action, and therefore it's an interactive opportunity where you can ask a subject to repeat an item, you can ask the family member or the caregiver for another view, or you can educate and help coach the family on safe and effective handling in a way to score the best and most valid representation of the subject's abilities. And as was mentioned twice before already, the accuracy for time tests such as the 10 meter or the time to rise, it's still being kind of worked out and determined. The evaluation of the qualitative aspects of these items are simple enough to document. However, the temporal component, the accuracy of that is still being explored. So stay tuned. So in our experience rolling out these functional assessments, these remote assessments, as you can probably imagine, the most time and effort was spent getting everything through our institution's regulatory groups. So that meant amending the protocol and getting IRB approval for the protocol, the informed consent, the CRFs, and that would be through, if you had a sponsored trial, going it through the sponsor and through your own regulatory bodies. And then also our plans for unscheduled visits, how we're going to document them, determining, what visits can be missed as a protocol deviation and which ones we're going to make up out of window. So going through that, all of that kind of documentation aspect of it. And then also there's the other side, which is the technology part. We worked with our IS department, not IRS, our IS department to determine the best video conferencing platform that would be both HIPAA compliant and would be secure. And so if that may be different than your EMR, whatever you use in your electronic medical record as well. So we had to figure out outside of our EMR, what would we be working best. And if your studies require video evidence, like many of the ones that we are a part of, we had to figure out how to video record these assessments as well. Luckily, we were able to use our institution's Zoom account, which also included a video recording option. If that is not an option for you, there's also some different programs that you could work with your technology department that can do video screenshots and things like that. So those are important considerations. So putting it into action. Our first attempt with finishing up our data collection for a study that evaluates the effect of an in-home body weight support harness systems on children treated for spinal muscular atrophy. We were kind of at the end of our study. It's our PT group study when COVID-19 hit. And preparing for our final assessments. And for this study, we ended up we have to actually travel to families' homes because that's where all the equipment was, and they lived all over the U.S. So when travel restrictions were put into place, and with the safety of our families in mind, these remote assessments became kind of our only option. So how great would it be to say that after all that preparation, the first remote visit was completed without an issue and a success. But this is the real world, so I can officially say that our first remote assessment offered a wonderful opportunity for growth. But with that wonderful opportunity, we took what we learned from that first visit and we rolled it over into our second, third, fourth, and fifth visits. And we were actually able to complete the study and capture all of the assessment data that we needed in a safe and comprehensive way. We were able to collect all of our primary endpoints, which was a huge win for us, and the implementation of these remote assessments really saved the day for this study. And we got to see videos of babies at home, so that was great too. Okay, so now I will share a few things with you from what we learned rolling this out. So the first thing is that video device placement is key. This is not just about the viewing field or what you can see or where it is in the room, but also, what is holding it up and what it is on. Doing the assessment over a smartphone chat application, while is accessible to most families, can lead to other issues, such as Lindsay mentioned, shaky and unsteady views, And then you can also get a good amount of video of close-up of someone's elbow or mom's pants, or things that you're not really meant to be video recording. And then also, number 2 would be remembering that this is a family's home, and therefore the usual day-to-day home-type distractions that family members don't really even think about anymore, such as siblings or pets, these can affect the quality of the assessment, and it can introduce unwanted variability. So scheduling a time when there are additional caregivers available to watch the siblings or take your dogs or unicorns for a walk. This can really help streamline your time with the subject and make the best time of the most efficient use of your time in your assessment and reduce your variability between assessments. And then lastly, and I cannot stress this enough, learning your video conferencing software. One thing we learned quickly is that we needed to pin our family screen as the main screen during our video assessment. If we did not do this, our software only recorded the screen of who was speaking, and which resulted in a lot of video of my team member giving instructions and encouragement to children, which, as much as I don't mind watching videos of myself and my team member, that is not really the purpose of this assessment. So in conclusion, while all of these remote assessments are different, we really want to treat them the same. We're striving for consistency across sites, across subjects, and across visits. So all of the best practice rules still apply that would apply in the clinic, still apply for remote assessments. This would include scheduling visits for the same time in the day, for the same evaluator, in the same environment. We want to have the same caregivers that are helping the first time consistently throughout. We want to make sure the subjects are well rested, they're well fed, they're not exhausted from, going out and having a ball at the playground the day before. We want to make sure that we get the most reliable and valid assessment of their function. And as was stated before, if you're unable to obtain valid results, do not score them. And yeah, so that is it for my section. And then Natalie Miller is going to come and talk about our clinical experience with telemedicine.
Thanks. So like Megan said, I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about our experience with telemedicine in the clinical setting. So a good and really exciting thing that we found is clinical telemedicine seems to work really, really well, and that's very encouraging. Our institution alone is performing over 2,600 Thearpy telehealth treatments per week, which is a remarkable achievement considering pre-COVID. So in March of 2020, we were performing 0. So that was a really big growth really quickly, and that way patients didn't lose access to therapy during this time. And like I said, it seems to work really well. We've heard feedback from the therapists and the families that they really like this telemedicine as a form of outpatient therapy. It's able to work on things that in the home environment, so you might not be able to recreate as well in the clinic, and you can work on really functional, family-centered goals with the patients in their home setting. So we anticipate that even when restrictions hopefully lift in the near future, that we'll see a kind of hybrid approach to outpatient therapy where they might do some visits in clinic and then might have some visits still telemedicine to work on things that they can't work on as well in the clinic. And so our neuromuscular physical therapy group here, we don't do outpatient treatment sessions, but our experience with telemedicine includes, in the clinical setting, includes insurance reauthorizations for ongoing commercial treatments, and then also we've been doing consultation and recommendations for multidisciplinary clinic patients. So thinking about that experience, specifically about the insurance reauthorizations that are required to have patients have continued access to these really important therapies that are now available commercially. The good news is we have had success with this. I have to say we were a little nervous starting because, like I said, these treatments are really important for patients' function and quality of life, and we didn't want to stand in the way of them not being able to get them during this time. So It is important to note that insurance companies have been lenient during COVID and they've been understanding, which is wonderful, but we don't know how that will look in the future. We hope that they will continue to accept remote assessments, but it's definitely something to keep an eye on in the future. So preparing for these visits, in addition to what every clinician does when preparing for an individual subject's visit and choosing the appropriate outcome measures based on that patient's diagnosis and their current level of function, you also have to think about which outcomes are feasible to do via telemedicine in the clinical setting. So, on one side of this spectrum, we have the assessments that you can pretty much do without thinking much about it, so that require little or no equipment or training to implement. So these include patient-reported outcomes. So we like to use the PROMIS assessments a lot, and we've just been administering these via telemedicine. You can also pretty easily check motor milestone achievements in patients and see if they've achieved any new milestones in this time or maintained ones that they had previously achieved. And then, upper extremity scales like the Brooke scale you can do without much equipment or training and get a good picture of what the patient looks like. And then in the middle, these assessments we have used a lot in telemedicine, but they require some equipment or some training for at least some of the items. So the GROW is, one of its benefits is that it's mostly observational. So you kind of ask the patients and families to do certain things and you just kind of score what you see. There are some items that are at the highest level of the scale that require either a little more space or maybe a little equipment that patients might not have, but a vast majority of the items, and for most patients, you could score this assessment easily. And then the Hammersmith and revised Hammersmith, they, like I said, most of the items you could do via telemedicine too. One thing to keep in mind with this is that they have required start and stop positions, so you might have to do a little more education with the caregiver that's helping you about exactly where the patient needs to start and stop to be able to score these items. And similar for the North Star or the NSAD. So most of the items you can do via telemedicine. There are some items that you'll have to problem solve a little bit with patients and families of, do you have a box step or do you have a seat that's the right height that we can use? But a vast majority of the items you could do clinically via telehealth. And then on the other end of the spectrum, for a clinical setting, we've found more difficult. So the ROLM, the PUL, and the 9-hole peg test, they all require specific equipment that families don't have in their home. So if you needed to do these assessments, you would have to plan ahead, similar to what we talked about in the research sections, that if you might have to ship equipment to the family, and that may or may not be feasible in a clinical setting. And then also, specifically the ROLM and the PUL, they require a little bit more instruction for the caregiver to administer too. So that's another thing to consider, that you need equipment and some advice and instruction on how to administer certain items on those assessments. So thinking about that, for the assessments that I said, most of the items can be done. So what if you choose an assessment and some of the items can't be performed via telehealth? And as therapists, we all know that there are some items that require a therapist there for safety. We're trying to see the patient's maximal abilities. In clinic, we're able to kind of challenge them because we know that we can keep them safe. But sometimes in the home, there might be a disconnect. The parents might not feel comfortable trying it, or you don't feel comfortable trying it. So safety is the first priority. So if it's not safe, skip that item. But the important thing to know is don't calculate a total score, because if insurance companies are comparing total score to total score and you weren't able to administer some items via telehealth, you don't want it to look like this patient declined when really you just couldn't administer certain items. So what we've been doing is, instead of only putting the total score in our notes and documentation for clinic, we've been showing each individual item score. That way you can just make a note that this item wasn't able to be performed via telehealth, but you could compare the other items and show either improvement or stability or whatever the case may be. Another thing to consider, and I think Megan briefly talked about it, is an example of this is the North Star. So that last item is the 10-meter run. And so the patient's asked to traverse 10 meters as fast as they can safely. A lot of patients probably aren't going to have a 10-meter space in their homes. However, you could ask the patient to run as fast as they are able to just across their available space, and that way you could still score the item as either 0, 1, or 2, but you just wouldn't include the time. So it's important we can be a little bit creative with clinical and making sure that we get the most information, but that it's still accurate and a good representation of the patient's function. A really important caution and note to bring up on the clinical side of telemedicine is if you're seeing out-of-state patients. So our center, like I said, our multidisciplinary clinic, patients come from out of state, out of country to receive specialized care at Nationwide Children's Hospital, which is wonderful. But in this situation, we found out that most states prohibit telehealth for PT or OT if you aren't licensed in that state. And some that we've come across is by no means an exhaustive list, but some of those states include West Virginia, Georgia, and Ohio. And some other ones say that you can do it, but you have to first apply for temporary licensure, which may include taking the jurisprudence exam. And some examples of those states are Indiana and Kentucky. So the states without specific guidance in their practice laws, you can document services were provided at the delegation of a physician during the declared COVID-19 state of emergency, but that only covers you if they don't have specific guidance in their practice laws. So it's really important to check for each state. And it's important to note that you have to look into the practice laws for the state where the patient resides, not you. So for us, since we're in Ohio, anyone that lives outside of Ohio, we have to look into that state's laws before we're able to say, yes or no, we can see this patient. Another note about out-of-state telemedicine is you may not be reimbursed, so you could check with payers ahead of time to check on the reimbursement status. But again, this only applies to clinical telemedicine, so research isn't included in this because you're serving as a clinical evaluator in a research setting versus practicing physical therapy via telemedicine like you are in a clinical appointment. So just to kind of wrap up here, what we've seen so far is that telemedicine is here to stay. We think that it's feasible and safe. And so we think that in addition to everyone adapting to the COVID-19 state of emergency, we think that we'll see this in the future, even when things hopefully clear up with travel restrictions and precautions. But it's really important to be prepared. And so, our group has talked about this before. It's very beneficial to take the time up front to look into all the policies, get to know all of your software systems and your assessments, and decide your process before trying to implement this so that you can be ahead of the game and do a proactive approach instead of reacting to problems as they arise, which with technology they inevitably will. And another thing to note is that success takes a good team. So we've mentioned some of the people that we've worked with in this, getting expertise from other people in the field, technology experts, clinical experts, research experts, our IRB, the list just goes on. And so it really takes a good team to make this happen. And so thank you guys again. I'm gonna switch it back to Linda.
Thank you very much for joining our webinar. We have a couple minutes for some questions, so I know some have come in on the chat box. The first one asks about how would we manage a multi-site international trial that requires a lot of assistance? And I know, Natalie, you've been working with one of our sponsors on getting equipment sent out and the right video supplies, so do you want to take that question?
Oops.
Sure.
So for a large-scale study, again, I think you have to really reinforce that process is important. So working with the sponsor, if it's a sponsor study, about determining which assessments you are going to focus on and which are feasible for telehealth. And so then working with all members of the team to make sure it meets regulatory standards, to make sure you can get the equipment shipped to the patient's homes, that they not only have equipment for assessments, but also equipment for recording, and making sure that everything meets security requirements as well, so that the platform is HIPAA compliant and that you know where you're going to store the videos like you would for any other clinical trial. So obviously the larger the scale and more spread out people are, the more discussions and processes you're going to have to do up front. But we do think it's feasible. The jury's still out a little bit, but we're excited to try these sort of assessments on a large scale. So I hope that helps answer a little bit.
Thank you. And we've also decided that it's probably easiest to send the equipment to the family and to leave it there. Most of the assessments that are currently being administered are not cost prohibitive to collect the information, collect the items, so we are going to just ship them and leave them. We also had a question about how are we handling time test with potential video lags. Megan? Will it work there?
Do you think it'll work here? Okay, perfect. Yeah, so I think we kind of touched on that a little bit. For right now, we are doing what we can to see. We've trialed with some families, sending them their own video recording equipment, so having them video record the time test as well as us video record the time test, and then we can compare the two and see if there is any discrepancy between those times. That's kind of what we're working on right now. As far as, outside of that, we're just kind of looking at not capturing the time and recording the time at the moment, just kind of looking at the qualitative aspects. So scoring on those ordinal level scales, scoring if they're able to do it, if they're using compensation, or if they're not using compensation. Anybody else?
I know, Lindsay, you were talking about the speed of the video. So we want to talk about what might be required to get an accurate time?
Sure, yeah. So I think that that cutoff of 1.5 megabits per second is kind of that minimal level of requirement, again, for both upload and download speeds. I will say anecdotally, for some of the early visits I've done in trying to time tests, I've been oddly impressed with how easy it's been. So it seems to be like we may be able, for some patients, to record some of these times in that live feed. But as Megan mentioned, we're kind of validating that with collecting some on-site video, because you never know what happens in the interweb.
We had another question about how to control the involvement of the parents and about how they're potentially influencing the children and how they're administering the assessments. They wanted to ask if we had any advice on how to manage those aspects. Volunteers, we've all had this issue.
Sure. This was one of the things that we had to kind of figure out during our harness study, is that I had to ask one family member to be in charge of just the video recording, and then the other family member being closer? Oh, the other family member then being in charge of helping or assisting. It just required a lot of verbal cues and verbal prompting and saying, I need to be able to see. That a lot of times, families really want to get involved, and so sometimes they kind of move in front of the camera, and all you're getting is a picture of mom's back or dad's back, which is not helpful. So just kind of being able to have your voice and say, if you could please step aside, or here's what I'm looking for. This is the construct of the item that I'm trying to see, educating the families that way, and then kind of encouraging them and constantly coaching them. It's not perfect, but it works.
Yeah, and I'd also add that we do run into this in the clinic as well. So it's kind of, as Megan said, it's different, but it's still kind of the same. So I think having the opportunity to communicate in advance, making sure the parents are aware that they are there to be our hands, do what we say, try not to interfere. And, I do explain that if they help too much, they can invalidate the data. And so I do think parents and family members have been kind of aware of that, and maybe a little more timid than I actually expected. So I think it's kind of a learning curve for everyone. And then I know Linda brought up the point about kind of data confidentiality. And so I just stress, when I'm doing these assessments, I'm not saying scores out loud, or talking about the scale and what I'm particularly looking for. I say, oh, that's great, just as I would in the clinic, and then write down my score on my side. So I do think there are ways to kind of mitigate that, even though we're doing this remotely with parents a little bit more involved than they are in the clinic.
Great, and as a children's hospital, we're used to doing assessments with very young children where the parents are in the room, and it's just important to have that dialogue that this test will cover a wide range of abilities, that your child should not get a perfect score, and it's okay if they don't get a perfect score, and that the data integrity is important, and so we need to see what their optimum abilities are. Another question came in about having assigned consent. Would the consigned consent change since we're having the caregiver video and help reading the instructions, and do we have all parties involved sign a consent?
I will take this as well. So what we had worked out, and I think it just is dependent on your institutional IRB standards and what they want. Through IRB, we decided that the best thing that we would do is that, and this guidance is also provided in that FDA document, is that we sent the mom, or we sent the family a copy of the consent prior to doing the video consent, and then so that the family had it and was able to read through it while you were doing the reconsenting process or the consenting process. The family would then sign, or a caregiver would then sign the consent form, and then they can fax it to you or secure email it to you, or any secure way of getting it back, a copy of it back to you. And then when they come back in for their next appointment, they can bring the actual source document back to you for your records, and you can make a copy and give it to them. Or you can have them mail it to you. So the idea is that you still want them to be able to review the document while you're going over it with them, have them sign it, have you have a copy of their signature before you're actually able to get that full source document back. I think for our IRB, the understanding was that for trials that were minimal risk or less, that you didn't have to have both caregivers sign the document. And then I think for anything more than minimal risk, both parties, if able, were needed to sign it. I hope that answers the question.
Great. We also, along those lines, had a question about, especially in the EU, that people are very hesitant to allow their child to be videotaped due to privacy laws, and how does this change anything with live streaming and the ability to record these? Natalie?
So I think that's a good question, and one of the things is to ensure that the platform that you're using is secure. So if you can look into that and tell patients and families that the streaming service that you've selected meets requirements, that's the first step. And then the other is, one of the things that we're doing is only the site is recording. So that's a consideration if there are stricter privacy statements. So then, with traditional on-site research assessments, we record the video for most studies and save it on a secure drive. So that part wouldn't exclusively change, but as long as you have the secure portal in place, then it shouldn't be too different in terms of privacy and security.
And I know Megan pointed out that this is a live stream. This is not recorded, so if you're in an area of the country or in Europe where you're not allowed to have video recordings, this is not a recording. It's a live stream that will go away unless you make the effort to record it. So it is the same as seeing the patient in the clinic. Let's see. They have one question about, what do you do if a child isn't cooperative? If you can't get them to do what you want them to do, but the family is insisting that they can do it. Lindsay?
Well, this is not different than in-person assessments. So I think, there are a few avenues. So I have had some children that seem afraid of kind of face on the iPad, that it is a little bit less personal than being in the clinic. I do think giving the child time to warm up to this, I think that's where those pre-visit calls can be really helpful, trying to involve the child in those so that they can get used to the platform, get used to what it's going to look like, just like they would in a clinic environment where they're going to be a little bit timid until they get to know you. There are instances where you can do all your best efforts and cartwheels and games to try and get the child to interact, and they just won't. And then that's where for our trials we've looked at having families upload videos of the child doing something, or you can't document what you don't see, but we can put comments where parent reports child's able to do this or that skill. There is the option as well, since there's less of that travel restriction. So a lot of times we have a really tight window for our visits on site because the family's got their plane to catch or they're leaving at the end of the day. Whereas here, they're going to be in their home. Another positive of the pandemic, I guess. So they're going to be in their home. So if the child's just having a really bad day, you can, within your visit window, or a clinic, it's a little bit more open, you can have a follow-up visit to see if, that child will be better in the morning when they're more rested if they're having a particularly crappy day. So the good news is I do think we still have options. It's just a matter of figuring out what's going to work best for that particular child and situation.
Looks like our last question has to do with how does our video platform that we're using for research implement well with our electronic medical record system?
Great. So we're currently using Zoom in our hospital, and we're able to access Zoom through Epic. So our research visits are the same as our clinical visits. And so it's actually quite nice, and it's been a seamless transition where, our patients show up on the schedule just as they typically would, and we just click the little video button and the video opens, and we're able to, have that interaction. You can chart at the same time alongside of the visit. And it's been a relatively seamless transition so far.
And in the clinic setting, one of the other things that we've been using a lot, which we didn't use before, was the chat. So that's how we've kind of communicated with different providers that are going to be seeing the same patient. So our nursing staff prepares it for us where just the providers that are scheduled to see that patient are included in a secure chat through Epic, and then we can kind of message back and forth of, okay, I'm finished up, it's your turn to go in, or if needs arise that are outside of your scope of practice but would be better suited for another provider, you're able to just send an instant message in a secure way, even if we're in different locations, like we would in a clinic setting if we were all present. So that's been really helpful too.
That concludes our webinar. We wanted to thank you for joining. We would be happy to discuss anything further or answer any more questions. The easiest way to get a hold of us is to email us at our group email. It's nmdtrialinfo@nationwidechildrens.org. Thank you so much for your time.